What if the road you drive every day hides something waiting in the dark? Welcome to Black Fears. Tonight, we're sharing 8 real trucker testimonies from the Pacific Northwest. Names and details have been changed for privacy, but these encounters actually happened. From breathing cargo to time loops on coastal highways, these stories will make you question what's out there on remote routes. Where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Drop your location and time in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to Black Fears for more disturbing real stories. My name is Marcus, and I've been hauling refrigerated freight for 6 years across the Pacific Northwest. Most drivers will tell you the job is routine once you get used to the isolation, the long stretches of darkness, and the hum of the diesel engine that becomes like a second heartbeat. I thought I'd seen everything this profession could throw at me until October 2019, when I picked up what should have been a standard load from a fish processing plant in Seattle. That night changed everything I thought I understood about what travels in the back of a semi-trailer on Interstate 90 through Snoqualmie Pass. The dispatch call came through around 6 p.m. on a Tuesday. They needed someone to run a refrigerated load of processed fish from a facility near the Seattle docks out to Spokane by morning. The pay was decent, the route was familiar, and I'd made the I-90 run dozens of times before. I pulled into the loading facility just as the sun was setting, casting long orange shadows across the industrial waterfront. The place smelled like you'd expect, that sharp brine mixed with diesel exhaust and the metallic tang of refrigeration units running at full capacity. A forklift operator whose name tag read Travis loaded the pallets efficiently, stacking crates of frozen fish in neat rows inside my trailer. He was quiet, methodical, barely making eye contact as he worked. I remember asking him if everything was secured properly, and he just nodded, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cold air pouring from the refrigeration unit. I signed the paperwork, did my standard walk-around inspection, and checked the trailer temperature gauge. Everything read normal at -10 degrees Fahrenheit. The door sealed with that familiar metallic clunk, and I climbed back into my cab, punching the destination into my GPS. The route would take me east through the mountains, a drive I could do half asleep if I had to. I grabbed a thermos of coffee from the passenger seat, adjusted my mirrors, and pulled out onto the main road, heading toward the interstate on-ramp. The Seattle traffic thinned out quickly once I cleared the city limits, and soon I was climbing into the Cascade foothills, the road narrowing as evergreen forest pressed in from both sides. My CB radio crackled occasionally with other drivers checking in, but mostly it was just me, the road, and the steady rhythm of the engine. Around 2 a.m. I was deep into the mountain pass near Snoqualmie when I first heard it. At first, I thought it was just the refrigeration unit cycling, that rhythmic thumping sound they make when the compressor kicks in. But this was different. It wasn't mechanical. It had an irregular pattern, almost like something was shifting around back there. I tapped my brakes slightly, thinking maybe the load had come loose despite Travis's careful stacking. The sound continued, a dull thud every few seconds, and I felt a faint vibration through the steering wheel that shouldn't have been there. I've hauled enough refrigerated loads to know when cargo shifts, and this felt wrong. The thumping grew more insistent, and I started tasting something metallic in my mouth, like I'd been chewing on aluminum foil. I pulled off at the next way station, an empty concrete pad with a single flickering light pole casting weak yellow illumination across the pavement. My breath formed clouds in the cold mountain air as I stepped down from the cab, and I could hear my boots crunching on gravel as I walked toward the back of the trailer. The thumping had stopped the moment I turned off the engine, which made my skin crawl. I stood there for a moment, listening to the absolute silence of the forest around me. No wind, no animals, nothing. Just that oppressive quiet that makes your ears ring. I unlocked the trailer door, the metal handle so cold it burned my palm even through my work gloves, and swung it open. The refrigeration unit's fan was still running, creating a low whirring sound, and cold air poured out in a visible wave of condensation. YouTube. The fish crates looked exactly as they should, stacked in perfect rows, wrapped in industrial plastic, each one labeled with processing dates and lot numbers. But the smell hit me immediately, and it was all wrong. Instead of the clean, cold scent of frozen fish, there was something else underneath. Something sweet and rotting, mixed with a sharp ammonia burn that made my eyes water. I pulled my flashlight from my belt and swept the beam across the cargo. Everything appeared normal. I stepped up into the trailer, the metal floor creaking under my weight, and moved closer to inspect the nearest crate. That's when I felt it. The crate was warm, not just cool from refrigeration failure, but actually warm to the touch, like something inside was generating heat. My hand jerked back instinctively, and I heard that sound again, a wet, rhythmic breathing that seemed to come from between the crates. I aimed my flashlight into the gap between two pallets and saw something that made my throat close up. The plastic wrapping on one of the crates was moving, expanding and contracting like a lung. I could see something dark and glistening beneath the translucent material, something that looked like flesh but wasn't fish. It pulsed with a rhythm that matched the breathing sound, and as I watched, frozen in horror, I saw what looked like veins spreading across the surface, dark purple lines branching out like roots. The temperature in the trailer suddenly felt wrong, too warm, humid, and I could taste that copper flavor getting stronger in my mouth, mixing with the sweet rot smell until I thought I might vomit. I stumbled backward, my boots slipping on the metal floor, and I heard something that will haunt me for the rest of my life. A long, wet exhale, like air being pushed out of damaged lungs, came from deep inside the cargo stack. The breathing sound synchronized across multiple crates, all of them expanding and contracting together, and I saw condensation forming on the inside of the plastic wrap, as if whatever was in there was exhaling warm, moist air. My flashlight beam shook violently as my hands trembled, and I backed toward the door, unable to look away from those pulsing masses. One of the crates shifted slightly, the pallet beneath it groaning, and I saw thick, clear fluid seeping out from underneath, pooling on the trailer floor and steaming in the cold air. I jumped out of the trailer, slammed the door shut, and fumbled with the lock mechanism with fingers that wouldn't stop shaking. I leaned against the cold metal, trying to catch my breath, and felt the entire trailer vibrate with that rhythmic pulsing from inside. I pulled out my phone and called dispatch, but when Sarah answered, I couldn't form coherent words. How do you explain what I'd just seen? How do you tell someone that your cargo of frozen fish is breathing? She kept asking if I was okay, if I needed roadside assistance, and I finally managed to say something about checking the load and finding some damage. She told me to complete the delivery and file a report afterward. I climbed back into my cab, locked all the doors, and sat there for 10 minutes just listening to my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I drove the rest of the route with every window down despite the freezing mountain air, trying to clear that sweet rot smell from my sinuses. The metallic taste in my mouth wouldn't go away, and I kept feeling phantom vibrations through the steering wheel, that same rhythm as the breathing I'd heard. I didn't stop again. I didn't even slow down except when I absolutely had to. I just kept my eyes on the road ahead and tried not to think about what was happening in the trailer behind me. Every bump, every slight movement of the truck made me think something back there was shifting, trying to get out, trying to reach the cab where I sat. When I finally rolled into the Spokane delivery facility just after dawn, I backed up to the dock and practically ran to the receiving office. The delivery crew unloaded everything while I stood outside, smoking 3 cigarettes in a row despite having quit 2 years earlier. When they finished, the dock supervisor came out holding a clipboard and told me everything looked fine. All crates accounted for, no damage. Temperature logs showed the refrigeration unit had maintained proper temperature the entire trip. I asked him to check the crates, to really look at them, but he just gave me a confused look and said they were already on their way to the processing line. There was no sweet smell, no warmth, no pulsing flesh beneath plastic wrap, just frozen fish exactly as the manifest described. I filed my report, collected my payment, and drove back to Seattle in a daze. For weeks afterward, I felt those phantom vibrations through the steering wheel whenever I drove, that same pulsing rhythm that matched breathing. I started having dreams about opening trailer doors and finding things that shouldn't exist, cargo that watches you with eyes hidden beneath industrial wrapping. Other drivers would talk on the CB about strange loads, about deliveries that didn't make sense, and I wanted to tell them what I'd experienced, but never could find the words. I still take refrigerated runs, still haul loads through Snoqualmie Pass in the middle of the night, but I never open the trailer doors anymore unless absolutely necessary. And whenever I pick up a load from that Seattle fish processing facility, I make sure someone else checks it first. Some things that travel on I-90 through the Washington Mountains aren't meant to be seen by human eyes, and some cargo breathes even when it shouldn't be alive. My name is Diane, and for 17 years, I transported logging equipment across the most remote stretches of mountain highway the Pacific Northwest has to offer. The isolation never bothered me. In fact, I preferred it. No traffic jams, no impatient drivers riding your bumper, just you and the wilderness stretching out in every direction. June 2003 started like any other month, with dispatch sending me on a familiar run along US 12 through Lolo Pass, that treacherous ribbon of asphalt connecting Idaho and Montana, where the Bitterroot Mountains rise up like ancient sentinels, watching every vehicle that dares cross their domain. The load was standard, hydraulic equipment and replacement parts for a logging operation near Missoula. I'd picked everything up from a supplier in Lewiston earlier that afternoon, and the plan was to cross the pass overnight when traffic was lightest. US 12 through that area isn't particularly well maintained, and you'd often find downed trees blocking sections of the narrow logging roads that branched off the main highway. I'd navigated those routes countless times, knew every switchback and blind curve by heart. The sun was setting behind me as I climbed into the foothills, painting the western sky in shades of orange and purple that looked almost artificial in their intensity. By the time full darkness settled over the mountains, I was deep into the most isolated section of the pass, miles from the nearest town or rest stop. The trees pressed close on both sides, towering pines and firs that blocked out any ambient light from the sky. My headlights carved a tunnel through the blackness, illuminating the white center line and not much else. The CB radio had gone silent hours ago, no other drivers on this stretch to chat with. Just static and the occasional burst of interference that sounded almost like voices but never resolved into actual words. I remember checking my fuel gauge and seeing I had plenty to make it through to the Montana side without stopping. That decision probably saved my life, though I didn't know it at the time. Around 3 a.m., I came across a fallen Ponderosa blocking the right lane. Its massive trunk stretched diagonally across the pavement, like someone had dropped it there deliberately. I slowed to a stop, put on my hazards, and grabbed my heavy-duty work gloves from the passenger seat. The tree wasn't enormous, maybe a foot in diameter, and I figured I could drag it clear if I used the winch cable from my flatbed. I stepped down from the cab into air so cold and still it felt like entering a vacuum. No wind at all, which was strange for this elevation. Usually, you'd feel some kind of breeze coming through the mountain passes, carrying the scent of pine needles and damp earth. But this was different. The air smelled metallic, almost electric, like the atmosphere right before a lightning strike. I walked toward the fallen tree, my boots crunching on loose gravel scattered across the pavement, and that's when I noticed the stars. I'd spent thousands of nights under open skies, navigated by constellations when GPS signals dropped out in remote areas, and I knew what the night sky was supposed to look like from this exact location. But the patterns overhead were wrong, not just slightly off, but fundamentally incorrect. The Big Dipper appeared distorted, its handle bent at an angle that violated basic geometry. Other stars formed configurations I'd never seen before, sharp, triangular arrangements that hurt my eyes when I tried to focus on them directly. The longer I stared upward, the more my depth perception failed. I couldn't tell if the stars were impossibly distant or uncomfortably close, hovering just above the treetops. A wave of vertigo washed over me, and I had to grab the side of my truck to keep from falling. The metallic taste in my mouth intensified, coating my tongue with something bitter and chemical. I forced myself to look away from the sky and focus on the tree blocking the road, but as I did, I saw something moving between the trunks of the surrounding forest. It was enormous, so massive that my brain initially refused to process what my eyes were registering. A shadow darker than the surrounding darkness, sliding silently through the trees in a way that made no sense. It wasn't moving forward or backward, but somehow existing in multiple positions simultaneously, as if the space it occupied was larger on the inside than outside. The shadow's presence caused physical reactions I couldn't control. My ears began popping repeatedly, pressure changes that made my hearing muffle and sharpen in alternating waves. I heard sounds coming from where the shadow moved, a combination that should have been impossible. Grinding metal mixed with deep whale song, frequencies so low I felt them vibrating in my chest cavity rather than hearing them through my ears. The grinding reminded me of industrial machinery tearing itself apart, while the whale song carried notes that seemed designed to trigger primal fear responses hardwired into human neurology. Every instinct screamed at me to run, get back in the truck, drive forward over the tree if necessary, just move. I stumbled back toward my cab, never taking my eyes off the shadow as it continued its impossible movement through the forest. It wasn't constrained by the trees. They seemed to bend around it. Or maybe it was bending space itself, creating pockets of wrongness wherever it passed. I could see stars through gaps in the forest canopy, and they were moving now, spinning slowly like water circling a drain. The entire sky appeared to be rotating around some central point directly above where the shadow moved. I tasted copper blood from biting the inside of my cheek without realizing it, and my hands shook so violently I could barely grip the door handle when I finally reached it. I climbed into the cab, slammed the door, and turned the key with fingers that felt numb and distant from my body. The engine roared to life, and I shifted into first gear, planning to edge around the tree using the narrow shoulder. But the moment I pressed the accelerator, something changed. Reality skipped like a scratched record. 1 second I was facing the fallen tree with my headlights illuminating its bark, and the next second I was 50 miles down the road, already on the Montana side of the pass, with dawn light starting to break over the eastern horizon. No transition, no memory of driving, just an instantaneous relocation that violated every law of physics I understood. YouTube I pulled over immediately, hands still gripping the steering wheel hard enough to make my knuckles ache. My logbook lay open on the passenger seat where I'd left it, and according to the last entry I'd made, 2 hours had vanished completely. The clock on my dashboard showed 5:47 a.m. My fuel gauge had dropped by an amount consistent with 50 miles of driving, and my odometer had advanced accordingly, but I had zero memory of covering that distance. The last thing I remembered clearly was seeing that shadow moving through the trees, hearing those impossible sounds, and then suddenly I was here, miles away. With the sun rising and the pass far behind me, I completed the delivery to Missoula in a daze, unloaded the equipment while a worker named Caesar checked off items on his clipboard, and drove back to Lewiston taking Interstate 90 instead of US 12. I couldn't face that pass again, not during daylight, certainly not at night. For weeks afterward, I experienced symptoms I couldn't explain to doctors, vertigo attacks whenever I looked at the night sky, nausea if I tried to focus on constellation patterns, a persistent sensation that my depth perception was permanently damaged. The distances were wrong in ways I couldn't articulate but felt in my bones. I filed a medical leave request and took 3 months off, the first extended break I'd taken in my entire career. Other drivers mentioned strange experiences on that stretch of highway when I carefully asked about it. Weird radio interference, time discrepancies. One guy swore he'd seen lights moving through the forest in patterns no aircraft or vehicle could replicate. But nobody talked about shadows that violated spatial laws or skies that rotated like water draining. I never told anyone the complete story, afraid they'd think I'd fallen asleep at the wheel and hallucinated everything. But I know what I experienced was real. The physical evidence was there in my logbook. Those missing 2 hours I can never account for. That 50-mile jump through space that should have been impossible. I continued hauling logging equipment for another decade after that night, but I never took overnight runs through Lolo Pass again. I couldn't. Even driving that route in full daylight triggered panic attacks, made my ears pop and my vision swim. I'd request alternate routes, longer hauls that added hours to delivery times, anything to avoid crossing that section of US 12, where the mountains hold secrets humans weren't meant to witness. To this day, I can't look at the night sky without feeling that same wrongness, that sensation of geometry failing and space bending around invisible masses too large for comprehension. Whatever moves through those Bitterroot peaks during the darkest hours doesn't follow the rules that govern our reality, and some boundaries between our world and others are thinner than we want to believe. Have you ever experienced a moment where time seemed to skip or reality felt fundamentally wrong in a way you couldn't explain? My name is Kyle, and February 2017 destroyed everything I thought I understood about how the world operates. Before that month, hauling freight along the Washington coast felt routine, predictable even. I'd been running routes between Seattle and the Olympic Peninsula for 4 years, knew every truck stop and loading dock from Tacoma to Aberdeen. The job suited me because I preferred solitude, enjoyed the independence of long-haul driving where your decisions mattered and nobody micromanaged your every move. US 101 became as familiar as my own living room, that winding coastal highway where the Pacific Ocean crashes against rocky cliffs and dense forests stretch inland for miles without interruption. The night everything changed started ordinary enough. I was heading south toward Aberdeen when my CB radio crackled to life around 11 p.m. The voice sounded professional, calm, rattling off coordinates for a pickup at an industrial warehouse near Willapa Bay. The dispatcher gave me specific turn-by-turn directions, mentioned the facility handled specialty equipment for fishing operations, and said the paperwork would be ready when I arrived. Nothing about the call seemed unusual except for one detail I noticed later. The voice giving me instructions sounded exactly like mine. Not similar, not close, but identical down to the slight rasp I get when I'm tired. At the time, exhausted from 10 hours behind the wheel, I didn't register the strangeness. I just programmed the coordinates into my GPS and followed the route as instructed. The GPS led me off the main highway onto progressively smaller roads, eventually depositing me at an industrial area I'd never noticed, despite driving this region countless times. The warehouse sat alone among empty lots overgrown with blackberry brambles and salal bushes. Security lights mounted on tall poles cast weak yellow pools across cracked pavement, and loading dock doors stood open despite the late hour. The building itself looked decades old, metal siding stained with rust and weathering, but those lights were definitely on. I pulled my rig up to the dock, set the air brakes, and climbed down to investigate. The silence felt oppressive. No workers moving around, no forklifts beeping, no sounds of any operation you'd expect at an active facility. I walked up the concrete steps to the loading dock and found a clipboard hanging on a hook beside the open bay door. The paperwork was already filled out, my name printed clearly at the top, along with my truck's DOT number and license plate. What made my stomach tighten was the date on the shipping manifest. It showed 3 days in the future. Not today's date, not yesterday's, but February 17th, when today was only February 14th. I stood there under those buzzing fluorescent lights, tasting something metallic coating my tongue, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe someone made a clerical error. Maybe the office worker accidentally wrote the wrong date. But the paperwork was otherwise perfect. Every detail accurate, including my dispatcher code and the route I'd driven to get here. The cargo sat on pallets just inside the warehouse, already shrink-wrapped and labeled for transport. Standard industrial shipping, nothing visually unusual about it. Since no workers were present to help, I grabbed the electric pallet jack sitting nearby and started loading everything myself. The warehouse interior was vast and mostly empty, my footsteps echoing off concrete floors and metal walls. As I maneuvered the second pallet toward my trailer, I noticed security monitors mounted in a corner office. The screens were active, displaying multiple camera angles of the loading dock area. I could see myself on those monitors, clearly visible from positions that should have been impossible. One camera showed a perfect overhead view, despite no visible mounting points on the ceiling. Another displayed an angle from inside my trailer looking out, except I hadn't installed any equipment in there. I loaded faster after seeing those monitors, ignoring the way my hands shook and my breath came quicker. The metallic taste in my mouth intensified, mixing with something bitter that made my throat tighten. I secured the last pallet, checked the straps twice out of nervous habit, and was heading back to close the warehouse bay door when I heard it. My own voice coming through the facility's intercom system, giving turn-by-turn directions for the exact route I needed to drive to reach the delivery address. The voice paused between instructions, and in those silences I heard myself breathing, heard the slight catch in my throat that happens when I'm anxious. It was like listening to a recording of myself, except I'd never made any such recording, and the directions were for a destination I hadn't been given yet. I ran back to my truck, climbed into the cab, and locked every door. The CB radio was still on, crackling with static, and then my voice came through the speaker again. Turn left in 0.3 miles. Merge onto US 101 northbound. Maintain speed limit. The instructions were precise, delivered in my own inflection patterns and speech rhythms. I grabbed the radio handset, intending to respond, to demand who was doing this. But before I could press the transmit button, I heard myself say, "Don't try to respond, Kyle. Just drive to the coordinates." The use of my name, spoken in my voice, coming from the radio felt like ice water dumped down my spine. I followed the instructions because I didn't know what else to do. The voice guided me through back roads and eventually onto the highway, maintaining a steady stream of directions that prevented me from thinking too clearly about what was happening. Every mirror I checked showed normal traffic, normal scenery, nothing visually wrong, but the taste in my mouth wouldn't fade, and I kept smelling something that reminded me of ozone, that sharp electrical scent that appears during thunderstorms. The delivery address, when the voice finally announced it, corresponded to coordinates in a rural area north of Aberdeen. The GPS showed an empty field when I zoomed in on satellite view. I arrived at the location just before dawn, pulling off onto a gravel access road that led to an undeveloped lot surrounded by second-growth forest. The voice on the CB went silent. No further instructions, no explanation, just static and the occasional burst of white noise. I sat in the cab as gray light crept across the sky, wondering if I should call the police, call my actual dispatcher, do something rational. Instead, I got out and opened the trailer to check the cargo. It was gone. Every pallet, every piece of equipment vanished completely. The trailer was empty except for the tie-down straps I'd used to secure everything, now lying loose on the floor. The metal walls showed no signs of forced entry. The door seals I'd personally checked were intact, but the cargo had disappeared as if it had never existed. I drove to the nearest truck stop, parked in a bright lot full of other rigs, and went inside to drink coffee until my hands stopped shaking. The waitress who refilled my cup was named Amanda, and she mentioned I looked like I'd seen a ghost. I didn't correct her, because ghost seemed too simple a word for what I'd experienced. When I finally worked up the courage to call my company's dispatch office, they had no record of the pickup assignment. The warehouse location I'd been to didn't appear in any of their databases. The cargo manifest I'd photographed on my phone showed up as a corrupted file when I tried to open it. Just gray static where the image should have been. I completed my scheduled runs for the rest of the month, but the voice kept appearing on my CB radio during night drives. Sometimes it gave directions I hadn't asked for. Sometimes it just breathed. That familiar pattern of inhalation and exhalation that matched my own respiratory rhythm exactly. Other drivers never heard it. When I asked Russell, a veteran hauler who often ran the same routes, if he'd experienced any weird radio interference, he just laughed and said CB radios were full of strange signals. He didn't understand that this wasn't interference. This was something using my voice, my breathing, my identity, to accomplish purposes I couldn't begin to understand. I quit long-haul trucking 3 months later. The final straw came when I was sitting in my apartment in Seattle, nowhere near my truck, and heard my own voice coming from the CB radio I'd left in the cab. I'd parked the rig in a secure lot miles away, locked and alarmed, but somehow the radio activated and started broadcasting. The building security guard called to complain about noise, said my truck's radio was transmitting loud enough to be heard across the parking lot. When I went to investigate, the radio was cold, unplugged, battery disconnected. Yet the guard insisted he'd heard it clearly. Heard. Someone giving directions to an address that didn't exist on any map. These days, I work warehouse logistics, never behind the wheel, never on those coastal highways where reality seems negotiable. But sometimes late at night, when everything is quiet, I hear my own voice giving instructions from rooms that are empty. I taste that metallic bitterness coating my tongue. I smell ozone where no storms exist. Whatever happened that February night near Willapa Bay didn't end when I left trucking. It just learned to follow me into spaces that should have been safe, using patterns and frequencies I can't escape because they're built from my own voice, my own breath, my own existence, copied and used by something that understands technology better than we ever will. What would you do if you heard yourself giving you instructions you never spoke? My name is Ibrahim, and September 2012 taught me why experienced truckers never, under any circumstances, pick up hitchhikers. The rule exists for good reasons, drilled into every driver during training and reinforced by countless stories of robberies, assaults, and worse. But that night, driving southbound on Interstate 5 between Olympia and Portland, rain hammering down so hard my wipers could barely keep up, I broke the cardinal rule. The figure standing on the shoulder near the Longview exit looked soaked through, hunched against the downpour, and something about the posture triggered a moment of stupid compassion. I slowed, pulled onto the shoulder with my hazards flashing, and unlocked the passenger door before my rational brain could override the impulse. The hitchhiker climbed up into the cab without speaking, water streaming off dirty rain gear that smelled like diesel fuel mixed with rust. I couldn't see much of a face beneath the hood, just shadows, and the faint gleam of eyes reflecting my dashboard lights. The passenger settled into the seat with careful, deliberate movements and pulled the door shut with a soft click. I asked the standard questions, trying to sound friendly despite the unease creeping up my spine. "Where are you headed?" "Rough night for walking, huh?" No response, just silence and the sound of rain pounding against the truck's roof. I shrugged, figured maybe the person was exhausted or didn't speak English well, and merged back onto the interstate. The wipers beat their rhythmic pattern, traffic was light, and I told myself everything was fine, even though my gut insisted otherwise. Mile markers clicked past. 10 miles, 20, 30. The passenger hadn't moved, hadn't adjusted position, hadn't made any sound beyond shallow breathing I could barely hear over the engine noise. I kept glancing sideways, catching glimpses of that rain gear, those hidden features, wondering what I'd invited into my space. The smell got stronger as we drove. that metallic rust scent mixing with diesel until it seemed to coat the inside of my nose and mouth. I cracked my window slightly, letting cold, wet air rush in, but it didn't help. The odor was too thick, too present, like it had soaked into the upholstery and dashboard. Around mile 40, approaching the rest area near Kalama, I decided I needed a bathroom break regardless of whether my passenger wanted one. I pulled off at the rest area, noting only 2 other trucks parked in the dark lot. The rain had lessened to a steady drizzle, and sodium lights cast everything in sickly orange tones. I told the passenger I'd be back in 5 minutes, grabbed my jacket, and climbed down. As I walked toward the restroom building, something made me glance back at my truck. The passenger was still sitting motionless in the cab, but the angle looked wrong somehow. The position seemed too rigid, too perfectly still for a human just resting. I shook off the feeling, used the facilities quickly while listening to rain drip from the roof overhang, and headed back across the wet pavement. That's when I saw them. Scratches covering the inside of my passenger door. Fresh gouges in the vinyl panel that definitely hadn't been there when I'd picked up my silent companion. I stood frozen with one hand on the door handle, staring at the damage. They weren't random marks. They formed patterns, deliberate lines scored into the material with something sharp. My pulse accelerated as I pulled myself up into the cab, trying to act natural while my mind raced. The passenger remained motionless, hadn't turned to acknowledge my return, that hood still concealing any features I might have used to read intent or emotion. I started the engine with hands that wanted to shake, pulled back onto the interstate, and tried to think clearly through the adrenaline flooding my system. I drove faster than I should have, pushing 10 miles over the speed limit, desperate to reach a more populated area where I could safely get this person out of my truck. The smell intensified until I could taste it. That rust and diesel combination now carrying undertones of something organic and wrong. My eyes kept darting to the passenger door, to those scratches, wondering when they'd been made. Had this person been carving into my truck while I sat oblivious, focused on the road? What kind of blade had created marks that deep, and why? The questions spiraled as I approached the outskirts of Portland, finally seeing buildings and streetlights that meant civilization and witnesses. I pulled into a large truck stop off I-5, one with bright lights and security cameras visible on every corner. I told the passenger this was my stop, that I couldn't take them any further. Still no response. I climbed down, walked around to the passenger side, and opened the door from outside. The seat was empty. Completely empty. Just those scratches on the door panel, and a cold dampness where someone had been sitting moments before. I stood there in the drizzle, staring at the vacant seat, unable to process what I was seeing. The person had been there. I'd driven 40 miles with them, smelled them, heard their breathing. They couldn't have just vanished. I checked under the seat, behind it, everywhere someone could possibly hide in a truck cab. Nothing. Just my normal belongings and those inexplicable scratches. Then I saw it, shoved partially under the passenger seat where it must have fallen or been placed deliberately. A manila envelope, water-stained and swollen, sealed with duct tape. My hands trembled as I pulled it out and felt the weight of photographs inside. I knew I shouldn't open it, knew whatever was in that envelope would make everything worse, but I couldn't stop myself. I tore the seal and dumped the contents onto the passenger seat. Photographs, dozens of them, all showing me, sleeping in my truck cab from angles that should have been impossible. Photos taken through my windshield while I was passed out at rest stops. Close-ups of my face slack with sleep, vulnerable and unaware. Some pictures were recent, taken within the last few weeks based on the clothes I was wearing. Others looked older, going back months, showing me in different trucks I'd driven for previous companies. Someone had been documenting me, photographing me at my most defenseless moments, collecting images like trophies or evidence. The dates written on the backs of the photos spanned 3 years. I gathered everything with numb fingers and went straight to the truck stop office. The night manager, a woman named Natalie, took one look at my face and asked if I needed her to call police. I said yes and spread the photographs across her desk while we waited. 2 state troopers arrived within 20 minutes, took my statement, examined the pictures and the scratches on my door. They photographed everything, bagged the evidence, and told me they'd seen cases like this before. Apparently, someone had been targeting long-haul truckers along I-5 for several years, leaving photographs and disturbing messages, escalating from documentation to more direct contact. 3 drivers had gone missing over that period. All of them had filed reports about finding similar pictures before they vanished. The investigation expanded rapidly once I filed my report. Police discovered more victims, other drivers who'd found photographs of themselves sleeping, but hadn't reported them out of embarrassment or fear of seeming paranoid. The pattern emerged clearly once authorities started connecting cases. 7 truckers total had documented encounters over 3 years. Most described picking up a hitchhiker who remained silent and disappeared mysteriously. All found photos afterward showing them sleeping in their cabs. The 3 missing drivers had all picked up passengers matching the same vague description. Someone in rain gear who never spoke, never showed their face, always left evidence of surveillance behind. I quit long-haul trucking 2 months later, despite the decent pay and the freedom I'd enjoyed. The photographs they'd found under my seat got submitted as evidence in an ongoing investigation that still hasn't produced any arrests or solid leads. Those images haunt me more than the scratches or the vanishing passenger. Knowing someone had been inside my truck repeatedly while I slept, close enough to take detailed pictures, patient enough to collect them over months or years, suggested a level of obsession and planning that went beyond normal criminal behavior. This was ritual, compulsion, something driving actions that followed rules I couldn't understand. I keep copies of 3 photos in a sealed plastic bag, locked in a drawer I never open unless absolutely necessary. The police said I could dispose of them once the case closed, but I can't bring myself to destroy the evidence of how vulnerable I'd been. Sometimes late at night, I think about all those rest stops I'd pulled. Into alone, all those times I'd dozed off trusting that locks and distance would keep me safe. I remember every instance of waking suddenly without knowing why. That feeling of being watched that I'd dismissed as paranoia or stress. Now I understand those instincts were correct, that something had indeed been observing, recording, building a collection of my unconscious moments. The other drivers who reported similar experiences formed an informal network, checking in periodically through social media groups dedicated to trucker safety. We share information about sightings, suspicious individuals at rest stops, anything that might help identify whoever orchestrated this surveillance operation. Some people theorize it's multiple perpetrators working together. Others think it's a single person who's mastered the interstate system well enough to target drivers across hundreds of miles. Law enforcement remains non-committal, acknowledging the pattern while admitting they have no solid suspects or forensic evidence that's led anywhere productive. I took a warehouse job in Portland after quitting the road, something that keeps me in one location with predictable hours and co-workers around constantly. But I still check my car every morning before getting in, still examine my house for signs of entry when I come home. The lesson from that rainy September night stays with me, reinforcing what I should have known from the beginning. Some rules exist because breaking them invites consequences you can't predict or control. The hitchhiker I picked up near Longview wasn't looking for a ride to somewhere specific. They were looking for another opportunity to get close, to document, to add to whatever collection justified their obsessive attention to drivers who thought they were alone. Would you stop to help a stranger on a highway at night, or does your gut already know better? My name is Santino, and April 1998 destroyed my understanding of what happens on certain stretches of US 95 after midnight. Before that spring, trucking felt straightforward. Predictable work governed by schedules and regulations that made sense. I'd been running freight through Idaho for 8 years, knew the highways better than my own neighborhood, could anticipate every way station and rest area without consulting maps. The Winchester location on US 95 was mandatory, one of those facilities where they check weight compliance and logbooks. Nothing remarkable about it during daylight hours. But at 1 a.m. on April 23rd, Winchester became something else entirely. A location where normal rules stopped applying, and older patterns emerged from whatever had existed there before highways and diesel engines. The night started routine enough. I was hauling manufactured goods from Boise, north toward Coeur d'Alene, running late because of loading delays at the warehouse. The dispatcher had been annoyed. Some guy named Callahan, who didn't appreciate scheduling disruptions, but eventually cleared me for the overnight run with instructions to make up time where possible. The highway was empty, just occasional headlights from southbound traffic, and the steady hum of my engine as I climbed into higher elevations. The radio played classic rock at low volume, and I was mentally calculating arrival times when I saw the Winchester way station lights ahead, that familiar yellow glow indicating the facility was operating even at this ungodly hour. I slowed and pulled onto the access road, noting immediately that something felt off. 12 other trucks sat parked in the weighing area, arranged in a perfect circle formation that couldn't have happened accidentally. Trucks don't park in circles. There's no practical reason for it. No efficiency or logic that would prompt drivers to position their rigs in geometric patterns. Yet there they were, headlights all pointed outward like spokes on a wheel, creating a ring of metal and machinery that looked deliberate, purposeful, wrong. My gut told me to keep driving, skip the mandatory stop, deal with potential fines later. But regulations are regulations, and I'd never violated protocol in 8 years of professional driving. So I pulled forward, parking outside the circle, and shut down my engine. The silence hit me first. 12 trucks idling should create constant noise. That rumble of diesel engines and cooling fans that forms the baseline soundtrack of any truck stop. But I heard nothing mechanical, just wind moving through nearby trees and something else underneath. A low-frequency hum that seemed to vibrate in my chest cavity rather than my ears. I grabbed my logbook and climbed down from the cab, boots crunching on gravel as I approached the way station office to check in. That's when I saw the drivers. All 12 of them stood outside their vehicles, positioned in the spaces between trucks, facing inward toward the center of the circle. They swayed in perfect synchronization, a slow rhythmic motion like kelp moving with ocean currents. And behind each driver, I could see shadows that were wrong. The shadows stretched upward, taller than the trucks themselves, rising into the darkness above the parking lot lights. They weren't cast by any visible light source, didn't obey normal rules about how shadows form or fall. Instead, they seemed independent, connected to the drivers, but moving slightly out of sync, as if the people and their shadows were operating on different frequencies of reality. The air around the circle tasted strange, metallic and bitter, with undertones of burnt sage and copper that coated my tongue and made my throat tighten. I stopped walking, frozen about 30 feet from the nearest driver, watching this synchronized swaying and trying to process what I was witnessing. Then I heard the sound. It came from the drivers' throats, but their mouths remained closed, lips sealed shut, while this chanting emerged from somewhere deeper. The language wasn't anything I recognized. Syllables that felt ancient and wrong, words that made my sinuses ache and my eyes water. The chanting had rhythm, but no melody, just repeated patterns that seemed designed to alter something about the space itself. I felt the ground vibrate beneath my boots, subtle pulses that matched the cadence of that throat singing, and noticed the shadows growing larger, stretching higher into the night sky as if responding to the sounds. My rational mind screamed at me to leave, get back in the truck, drive away from this mandatory stop regardless of consequences. But my body wouldn't respond. I stood paralyzed, watching those synchronized movements and listening to sounds that human vocal cords shouldn't be able to produce. The taste in my mouth intensified, that burnt sage mixing with copper until I thought I might vomit. My nose started bleeding without warning, hot liquid running over my lips and dripping onto my shirt. I raised one hand to wipe the blood away, and one of the drivers turned to look at me. The motion was smooth, unnaturally fluid, and when the driver's face came into view, I saw eyes that reflected too much light, pupils that seemed to glow faintly with their own luminescence. The driver approached, movement still synchronized with that ocean current sway, and opened their mouth to speak. The language that emerged made my nose bleed harder, made pressure build behind my eyes until my vision blurred. I couldn't understand the words, but felt their meaning somehow, felt them trying to rewrite something fundamental about my presence in this space. The shadows behind all 12 drivers moved closer, converging toward the center of the circle where nothing visible existed but the air looked thick, distorted, like heat shimmer over summer pavement. I tasted copper so strongly now that I gagged, stumbling backward, while blood continued pouring from my nose and the pressure in my head built to unbearable levels. Then the world skipped. One moment, I was backing away from the approaching driver, watching those glowing eyes and two tall shadows, and the next moment, I was sitting in my truck cab with my engine running. Sunlight streamed through the windshield, warming my face, and the dashboard clock showed 6 a.m. 5 hours had passed instantaneously. My logbook sat open on the passenger seat with no entry recorded for the Winchester stop. The way station lot was empty. No other trucks visible, just normal morning traffic starting to build on the highway beyond. My shirt front was stiff with dried blood, my nose crusted but no longer bleeding, and I had zero memory of those missing hours beyond that moment of the world skipping forward. I drove away, without checking in at the way station office, violated protocol for the first time in my career because I couldn't face whatever personnel might be working there in daylight. My hands shook on the steering wheel for the next 50 miles, and I kept tasting copper, even after drinking an entire thermos of coffee trying to wash the flavor away. When I finally stopped at a regular truck stop near Coeur d'Alene, I locked myself in the bathroom and examined my face in the mirror. Blood had dried in tracks down my chin and neck. My eyes showed burst blood vessels, tiny red spider webs across the whites. But otherwise, I looked normal. No visible signs of whatever had happened during those lost hours. I completed the delivery in a fog, unloaded the cargo with help from warehouse workers who kept asking if I was okay, if I needed medical attention. I lied and said I'd had a bad nosebleed from dry air, nothing serious. Then I drove back to Boise, taking back roads, avoiding US 95 entirely, even though it added 3 hours to the return trip. For days afterward, I researched Winchester, trying to find historical information about the location where that way station now operated. What I discovered made my blood run cold. The facility sat on land that had been an indigenous ceremonial site for centuries before white settlement, a location used for rituals and gatherings whose purposes anthropologists still debated. I wasn't the only driver who'd experienced something at Winchester. Careful questions on CB radio and at truck stops revealed 4 other haulers who'd stopped there late at night and witnessed similar phenomena. One guy described seeing trucks arranged in circles with drivers performing synchronized movements. Another talked about losing time, arriving hours later than possible with no memory of the interim. A third mentioned shadows that didn't match any light source and sounds that made his ears bleed. None of us filed official reports because who would believe such accounts? We'd sound delusional, would face medical suspensions and psychological evaluations that could end our careers. The pattern suggested something recurring, some event that happened. periodically at that specific location when conditions aligned correctly. Whether the 12 drivers I'd seen were willing participants or unwitting tools for something older than highway systems, I couldn't determine. But the synchronization, those throat sounds and impossible shadows, indicated purpose and intelligence behind what I'd witnessed. Something used that space, transformed it temporarily into a location where different rules applied and realities overlapped in ways humans weren't meant to observe. I continued trucking through Idaho for another 6 years before switching to regional routes that never took me near Winchester after dark. The memory of that April night remained sharp, refusing to fade the way normal memories do over time. I still taste copper occasionally for no medical reason, still see shadows move independently in my peripheral vision, still feel that ground vibration rhythm in quiet moments when nothing should be causing such sensations. Whatever congregation occurred at Winchester that night wanted something, accomplished something, and I was either witness or participant, depending on what happened during those 5 missing hours my conscious mind can't access. They say certain locations hold power, that geography itself can be sacred or cursed, depending on what occurred there across centuries. Winchester proved that theory correct for me, demonstrated that highways and way stations and modern trucking infrastructure get built on top of older patterns without erasing them. The ceremonies continue. The congregations still gather, and sometimes regular people stumble into spaces where they become temporary parts of rituals they don't understand and can't remember. All I know for certain is that 12 drivers stood in a circle performing synchronized movements under shadows too tall to be natural, and when reality skipped forward, I'd somehow become part of whatever they'd been doing, whether I consented or not. What ritual did those missing 5 hours contain, and what part of it still lives inside me now? My name is Bradley, and November 2021 showed me that some warnings get left behind deliberately, breadcrumbs meant to save whoever comes next. The company assigned me a different rig that month, a Peterbilt that had just come back from extended maintenance after its previous driver quit without notice. Management seemed eager to get the truck back in rotation, offered me a decent bonus for taking on the Montana-Idaho route through Lookout Pass, despite winter weather advisories. The pay was good enough that I didn't ask too many questions about why the last driver had abandoned such a reliable truck mid-contract. I should have asked those questions. I should have wondered why a vehicle in perfect mechanical condition would sit idle for 3 weeks, while the company scrambled to find someone willing to drive it. I picked up the rig from the company yard on a gray afternoon, temperatures already dropping toward freezing as storm systems moved down from Canada. The truck looked immaculate, freshly detailed inside and out, maintenance records showing every system had been inspected and certified. I did my standard walk around, checked fluid levels and tire pressure, tested lights and brakes, found nothing concerning. The cab interior was clean, almost sterile, as if someone had scrubbed away any trace of the previous driver's presence. I tossed my overnight bag onto the passenger seat, adjusted mirrors and seat position, and was about to start the engine when I noticed the glove compartment hanging slightly open. Inside sat a spiral-bound maintenance log, the kind drivers keep for personal records separate from official DOT documentation. The cover showed coffee stains and wear from months of use, and the handwriting inside belonged to someone with neat, precise penmanship. I flipped through pages of routine entries noting fuel consumption, minor repairs, weather conditions encountered on various routes. Normal stuff that any careful driver might record. Then the entries changed. Starting about 6 weeks before the truck had been pulled from service, the tone shifted from factual documentation to something else entirely. The driver, whoever they'd been, started describing experiences that had nothing to do with mechanical maintenance. The first concerning entry was dated October 12th and described noticing a figure in the passenger side mirror while driving through Lookout Pass at night. The driver had written that the figure appeared only at mile marker 0, visible for just a few seconds before disappearing as the truck continued forward. The entry dismissed it as fatigue, tricks played by tired eyes and darkness, but subsequent pages showed the figure appearing again, night after night, always at the same location. The descriptions became more detailed with each sighting. The figure had wrong proportions, limbs too long for its body, a face that remained blurred no matter how directly the driver tried to observe it. By late October, the entries revealed genuine fear. The driver wrote about smelling wet earth filling the cab when the figure appeared, about feeling temperature drops so severe that frost formed on the inside of windows despite the heater running at full blast. I sat in the company parking lot reading these entries, feeling cold that had nothing to do with November weather. The final pages were worst. The last driver had researched Lookout Pass, discovered that the previous operator of this exact truck had driven off a cliff there 3 years earlier. The official report called it an accident, loss of control on icy roads, but the maintenance log suggested otherwise. The driver who'd written these entries believed the figure in the mirror was somehow connected to that earlier death, that whatever appeared at mile marker 0 was trying to cause another accident, trying to add another victim to whatever pattern it followed. The very last entry, dated November 3rd, consisted of just 6 words written in shaking handwriting. "It's in the cab now. Don't look right." I should have returned the truck immediately, told management I wasn't comfortable with the assignment, demanded a different rig. Instead, I did what professional drivers do. I rationalized, told myself the previous operator had experienced a mental health crisis, that the entries reflected psychological problems rather than anything supernatural, convinced myself that the maintenance issues and driver turnover were coincidental, that my own experience would be completely normal. I started the engine, pulled out of the yard, and headed east toward the Montana border, with a delivery schedule to keep and miles to cover before stopping for the night. The route took me through Spokane and onto Interstate 90, climbing steadily into the Bitterroot Mountains as daylight faded. Traffic thinned to almost nothing as I approached the Idaho-Montana border, just occasional headlights from eastbound traffic, and the endless darkness of forest pressing close on both sides. I'd driven this stretch dozens of times in previous years, knew every curve and grade, felt comfortable with the road despite deteriorating weather. Light snow began falling around 9 p.m., not heavy enough to require chains, but sufficient to reduce visibility and make pavement slick. I reduced speed, increased following distance behind the few vehicles ahead of me, maintained all the safety protocols that had kept me accident-free for 12 years of professional driving. Mile marker 0 appeared in my headlights at 10:47 p.m. according to the dashboard clock. I knew the marker was coming, had been watching for it despite telling myself the maintenance log entries were fiction, products of imagination rather than documentation. As I passed the sign, I checked my passenger side mirror out of compulsion, unable to resist the urge, even though I expected to see nothing but empty highway behind me. The figure was there, exactly as described in those handwritten entries, visible in the mirror's reflection but not present when I turned to look directly through the passenger window. It stood at the roadside, proportions wrong in ways my brain struggled to process, face blurred, as if reality couldn't quite render its features properly. I felt my throat tighten and tasted something earthy and damp coating my tongue. The smell hit seconds later, overwhelming the cab's interior despite closed windows and recirculating ventilation. Wet earth, like freshly turned soil after heavy rain, mixed with something organic and rotting that made my eyes water. Temperature dropped so rapidly that I saw my breath fog in front of my face. Watched frost patterns begin spreading across the inside of the windshield despite the heater running at maximum. My hands gripped the steering wheel hard enough to make my knuckles ache, and I kept my eyes fixed on the road ahead, refusing to check the mirror again. The figure couldn't possibly still be visible. I'd traveled well past mile marker 0, put distance between myself and wherever that thing actually stood, but I could feel its presence, sense something wrong occupying the space just beyond my peripheral vision. The next 30 miles were the longest of my life. I maintained speed mechanically, navigating curves and grades while fighting the overwhelming urge to look right, to check that passenger mirror and confirm whether anything followed. The smell intensified until I thought I might vomit, until breathing felt like inhaling cemetery earth. Frost continued spreading across windows in patterns too geometric to be natural, forming symbols and shapes I didn't recognize but that made my eyes hurt when I tried to focus on them. Cold penetrated my heavy jacket, made my fingers numb on the wheel, had me shivering violently despite layers of clothing. And underneath everything, I heard breathing. Not my own labored respiration, but something else. A slow, rhythmic sound coming from the passenger seat, where nothing visible sat. I white-knuckled through that mountain pass, fought every instinct screaming at me to stop, to flee, to do anything except continue driving with whatever presence shared my cab. The figure appeared in my mirror at irregular intervals, sometimes gone for miles before reappearing closer, proportions wrong in new ways each time. Its blurred face seemed to be trying to resolve into features I could recognize, and some primitive part of my brain insisted that if those features ever became clear, if I ever saw what that face actually looked like, something irreversible would happen. So I drove without looking right, kept my attention locked forward, and counted down mile markers until I finally crossed into Montana proper, and the presence vanished like it had never existed. I pulled into the first truck stop across the state line, parked under the brightest lights available, and sat shaking for 20 minutes while sensation slowly returned to my frozen fingers. The cab smelled normal again, just diesel and coffee and the faint mustiness of an older vehicle. Temperature had returned to levels consistent with the heater's output. No frost-decorated windows. No breathing sounds disturbed the silence except my own. I grabbed the maintenance log and read that final entry again, those 6 words that now carried weight they hadn't possessed hours earlier. It's in the cab now. Don't look right. The previous driver had written those words after experiencing exactly what I'd just survived, had documented their fear, and then made a decision I was only beginning to understand. Later, research revealed details the maintenance log hadn't mentioned. The driver who'd written those entries was named Isabella, a veteran hauler with 15 years of experience and a spotless safety record. She'd quit 3 days after that final log entry, abandoned a career she'd built over more than a decade, refused to explain her decision to company management. When I tracked her down through driver networks and trucker forums, she agreed to talk only once I mentioned the figure in the mirror. Her voice over the phone was quiet, careful, like someone discussing something that might hear and respond. She told me the previous truck operator, the one who'd driven off the cliff at Lookout Pass, had been her mentor. She'd driven that same route weekly for months after his death, never experiencing anything unusual until the company assigned her his old truck after it had been repaired and returned to service. Isabella said the figure started appearing immediately, always at mile marker 0, always visible only in mirrors, always accompanied by that wet earth smell and impossible cold. She'd researched and discovered the pattern went back further than just one death. Over 20 years, 5 different drivers operating that specific truck had died at Lookout Pass in single-vehicle accidents that officials attributed to weather or mechanical failure. But each driver had documented strange experiences before their deaths, had mentioned figures in mirrors and sensations of presence, had written warnings that later operators either ignored or never found. She told me the figure was patient, that it appeared night after night building familiarity, trying to make drivers look right at the wrong moment when their attention should have been on the road. I completed my contract delivery to Missoula, then returned the truck to company yard and requested permanent reassignment to different routes using different vehicles. Management didn't ask questions, just processed the paperwork and gave me a newer rig running regional routes that never crossed through Lookout Pass. The maintenance log stayed with me, though. I kept it as evidence, documentation that some warnings are real, that the boundaries between normal trucking and something older exist in specific locations under certain conditions. 5 drivers dead over 20 years, all operating the same truck, all experiencing the same phenomena before their final accidents. The pattern was clear to anyone willing to see it, suggesting intelligence and purpose behind what appeared in those mirrors. I never drove through Lookout Pass at night again, never operated that specific truck model, never ignored the instinct that screams warnings when something feels fundamentally wrong. The figure at mile marker 0 is still there, still appearing to whoever drives past in the right vehicle, still trying to make them look right when doing so would be fatal. And somewhere in company archives sit maintenance logs from other drivers who documented their experiences and tried to warn whoever came next. Breadcrumbs left behind by people who understood they were being hunted by something that uses mirrors and roads and vehicles to accomplish purposes we can't comprehend. If you found a journal warning you about something impossible, would you keep driving or listen to the fear? My name is Baylor, and January 2015 proved that some things hunt in blizzards, using whiteout conditions and frozen roads as cover for approaches that would be impossible in clear weather. Before that winter, I'd hauled through Stevens Pass countless times, navigated US 2 through every kind of mountain weather Washington throws at drivers. Snow, ice, fog, freezing rain. I'd experienced it all and felt confident in my ability to handle whatever conditions developed. That confidence nearly killed me. What stalked my jackknife truck during those 14 hours of isolation wasn't natural, wasn't something you could prepare for with tire chains and emergency supplies, and left evidence that investigators couldn't explain despite their best efforts to rationalize what happened. The run started in Spokane with a load of industrial equipment destined for Everett, a straightforward westbound haul across the state that I'd completed dozens of times. Weather forecasts predicted heavy snow over Stevens Pass, but nothing unusual for January, nothing that warranted postponing the delivery. I left mid-afternoon planning to cross the mountains during evening hours before conditions deteriorated overnight. The snow started falling as I climbed into higher elevations, fat flakes that quickly accumulated on pavement and reduced visibility. I slowed appropriately, maintained safe following distances behind the sparse traffic ahead of me, kept my attention focused on the road rather than allowing my mind to wander. The black ice appeared without warning around 8 p.m. near the summit elevation, a patch of invisible frozen slickness that sent my trailer swinging sideways despite careful speed control. I fought the skid instinctively, tried to straighten out, but physics and momentum won. The truck jackknifed, slid off the highway into a snowbank, and came to rest at an angle that prevented any possibility of self-recovery. The engine died on impact. Emergency lights activated automatically, flashing orange warnings into the swirling snow. I sat gripping the steering wheel, adrenaline making my hands shake, taking inventory of damage and options. The cab appeared intact, no broken glass or deployed airbags, but the position was bad, blocking part of the right lane with limited visibility for approaching traffic. I grabbed my phone to call for assistance and discovered no signal. The storm had intensified, wind driving snow horizontally across the windshield, temperature dropping rapidly toward 0. I tried the radio, got only static and occasional bursts of interference that sounded almost like words but never resolved into actual communication. The emergency protocol was clear: stay with the vehicle, keep warm, wait for highway patrol or tow services to arrive. Moving around outside in these conditions risked hypothermia and getting lost in whiteout visibility. So I activated my emergency flashers, turned the battery-powered heater on low to conserve power, and settled in to wait for rescue. That's when I noticed the prints. Massive indentations in the snow surrounding my truck, visible in the glow from my emergency lights. They looked like handprints, but wrong, too large for any human, showing 7 distinct finger marks instead of 5. Each print measured at least 18 inches across, pressed deep into fresh snow as if whatever made them carried enormous weight. I counted 12 prints in a rough circle around my position, and while I watched through the frosted windows, more appeared. Something was walking around my truck, leaving these impossible tracks, moving with deliberate slowness as if inspecting my vehicle from multiple angles. The scraping started minutes later, metal on metal, sharp and rhythmic, coming from the trailer roof directly above where I sat. I could feel vibrations through the seat, regular impacts suggesting something heavy was pacing back and forth on top of the cargo container. The sound reminded me of claws or talons dragging across steel, creating furrows deep enough to transmit sensation through layers of insulation and metal. My mouth went dry. My heart hammered against my ribs. Every survival instinct screamed contradictory instructions. Stay inside where it's relatively safe. Get out and run before whatever's on the roof breaks through. Do something. Do nothing. Just survive the next few minutes and maybe rescue would arrive. I stayed frozen in the driver's seat, afraid any movement would attract attention from whatever circled my truck. Through gaps in the swirling snow, I caught glimpses of it, fragmentary images that my brain struggled to assemble into coherent form. Something translucent moved with spider-like fluidity, limbs that bent at too many joints, a body that seemed to shift and flow rather than moving with rigid skeletal structure. The glimpses never lasted long enough to provide clear details, just impressions of wrongness, of anatomy that violated everything I understood about how creatures are supposed to look and move. The color was wrong, too. Not quite invisible, but refracting light strangely, like looking at something through textured glass or heat shimmer. The temperature inside the cab plummeted despite the battery heater running continuously. My breath formed thick clouds, frost patterns spreading across the inside of windows in geometric designs that looked too regular to be natural. I wrapped myself in the emergency blanket from my survival kit, pulled my hood tight, and tried to stop shivering hard enough to make my teeth chatter. The cold felt aggressive, purposeful, like something was actively draining heat from the enclosed space. My fingers went numb inside heavy gloves. My face ached where exposed skin touched frigid air. And through it all, that scraping continued overhead, the sound drilling into my awareness until I thought I might scream just to break the rhythm. Hours passed. The storm showed no signs of lessening. Visibility remaining near zero, wind howling around the disabled truck with voices that sounded too human to be natural weather patterns. The thing kept circling, kept pacing on the roof, occasionally stopping to press against windows as if trying to see inside. I never got a clear look at its face, if it had a face, but I felt its attention focused on me with predatory intensity. It knew I was trapped, knew rescue wouldn't arrive quickly in these conditions, and seemed content to wait with the patience of something that hunts by exhausting prey rather than overwhelming them with speed or strength. Around 3 a.m., the scraping stopped. Silence fell, except for wind and my own ragged breathing. I risked movement for the first time in hours, turned my head slowly to check all windows, saw nothing visible outside except white storm and darkness. Relief flooded through me, premature and stupid because the thing hadn't left. It had just changed position. I felt the truck shift slightly as weight redistributed, heard metal groaning under stress, realized something was underneath now, crawling between the chassis and ground, exploring the truck's undercarriage with those too many jointed limbs. The vibrations intensified. The entire vehicle shook as if something enormous was trying to lift or tip it. I grabbed the steering wheel for stability, pressed myself back into the seat, and tasted blood from biting my tongue. The shaking continued for minutes that felt like hours, then stopped as abruptly as it began. Silence again, just storm noise and the creaking of cooling metal. I didn't dare move, didn't trust the apparent absence. Experience over the past hours had taught me the thing operated in patterns, alternating between active investigation and patient observation, always returning when I started to believe it might have finally departed. Dawn arrived slowly, gray light filtering through snow that had finally lessened to occasional flurries. The temperature remained brutally cold, but visibility improved enough to see the highway clearly for the first time since the accident. I spotted flashing lights approaching from the west, a highway patrol vehicle followed by a heavy recovery truck, and felt something close to religious gratitude. The scraping had stopped an hour earlier, the circling presence apparently withdrawn, but I'd been too afraid to attempt any communication or signal for help, terrified that movement or noise would trigger another attack. The patrol officer who reached my door first was named Desmond, a veteran who'd worked these mountain passes for over a decade. He took one look at my face and immediately called for medical evaluation, concerned about hypothermia and shock. I stumbled through explanations about the jackknife, the storm, waiting for rescue, but couldn't bring myself to mention what had circled my truck through the night. He'd think I was delirious, experiencing hallucinations from cold exposure and stress. But then he walked around my vehicle, examining the damage for his report, and I heard him call his partner over with urgency in his voice. The trailer roof had deep gouges scored into the metal, parallel lines running lengthwise for dozens of feet. The marks were fresh, bright steel exposed, where something had torn through protective coating and into the structural material beneath. The undercarriage showed similar damage, chassis components scratched and bent, as if grabbed by enormous mechanical claws. And the snow around my truck was full of those impossible prints, 7-fingered handprints that measured far too large for human origin. Pressed so deep, they'd survived hours of additional snowfall without filling completely. Desmond photographed everything, took measurements, called in additional units to document the scene. The official explanation settled on wildlife, probably a bear disturbed from hibernation by the storm, investigating the disabled truck out of curiosity or hunger. The prints got attributed to snowmelt and refreeze patterns that distorted their original shape. The gouges became evidence of the animal climbing on the vehicle, its claws scraping metal as it tried to access potential food sources. Every anomaly received a rational explanation that fit within acceptable boundaries of normal occurrence. But Desmond pulled me aside before I left in the ambulance for medical evaluation, speaking quietly where other responders couldn't overhear. He told me 3 other truckers had reported similar experiences on Stevens Pass over the past 5 years, always during severe winter storms, always involving something that circled their stranded vehicles and left impossible evidence behind. I spent 2 days hospitalized for hypothermia and frostbite, lost partial sensation in 3 fingers that never fully recovered. The company totaled my truck due to damage costs exceeding the vehicle's value, those deep gouges requiring replacement of major structural components. Insurance investigators questioned me extensively about what happened during those 14 hours, suspicious that the damage patterns didn't match their wildlife theories, but unable to propose alternative explanations that made more sense. I stuck to my official story, described the jackknife and the wait for rescue, mentioned hearing animals outside but seeing nothing clearly through the storm. Some lies are necessary when truth sounds too insane to be believed. I quit long-haul trucking after that winter, took a regional position running daytime routes that never required mountain passes or overnight stops in isolated locations. The memory of those hours stays sharp despite time and distance, refusing to fade the way normal traumatic experiences eventually do. Something hunts in Stevens Pass blizzards, uses whiteout conditions to approach stranded vehicles, examines trapped drivers with intelligence and purpose that suggests more than animal curiosity. whether it's territorial, protecting something humans shouldn't find, or simply opportunistic, drawn to vulnerable prey by instincts we can't understand, I'll never know. I only know it's real. It left evidence that officials had to rationalize away, and 3 other drivers encountered the same thing without any of us knowing about the others until Desmond connected the patterns. The prints in the snow, those 7-fingered handprints pressed deep by something translucent and wrong, haunt me more than the cold or the fear. They prove the thing exists in physical form despite appearing almost invisible, that it has mass and weight and substance even if our eyes can barely perceive it. And if one of these things stalks Stevens Pass, how many others might inhabit different mountain ranges, different isolated highways, where storms and darkness provide cover for approaches that would be impossible in daylight? How many other drivers have encountered similar entities without ever reporting their experiences, choosing silence over being labeled delusional or unstable? If something starts circling your vehicle during a storm, leaving prints no animal should make, do you stay inside or risk running blind into the white? My name is Banks, and if there's one night I'll never forget, it's the August 2023 run-up US 101 between Tillamook and Astoria. I've always said, routine is what keeps a trucker sane. Same coastal winds, same stretches of asphalt winding between pine-lined ridges and churning cliffs, same early dawns with salt fog rolling off the Pacific. Most long haulers crave surprise and adventure. Not me, not after 15 years. I survive on the predictable beat of the road, every mile checked and logged, every odd little town a familiar landmark where nothing unexpected is ever supposed to happen. This run began with a double check. Logs, route, destination, even my supplies. There was a storm the night before, and dispatch, Sophia, as exacting as ever, warned about possible debris at a few sections. If the coast highway loops on your GPS, ignore it, she told me. Reset and keep driving north. It's a satellite lag from the bad weather. Seemed simple enough at the time. I drove out of the depot as the last bits of night clung to the sky, passing shuttered gas stations and logging yards that always gave off that mix of damp wood and motor oil. Air heavy with the taste of brine drifted through the vent. The smell of rain lingered in the seat fabric, a reminder of the storm. It started with the lighthouse. My headlights flicked over the whitewashed fence at milepost 63, and the light, always oddly steady in contrast to the roaring wind, swept over my cab, painting everything inside with a weird, sterile glow. I'd seen that lighthouse 100 times, saw it again 30 minutes later, which made no sense. US 101 is a loop at points, but not like that. Not a flawless copy of scenery you already passed. GPS pinged, "Continue on the current road," as if I'd veered, but I hadn't. Drowsiness, maybe. No, I just poured a cup of strong black coffee and could feel it tingling at the back of my teeth. The taste was bitter, laced with that metallic after-hint you get from cheap thermoses and nerves. The third time I passed the lighthouse, it was under a sky darkening by shades that had nothing to do with approaching evening. Clouds bunched low, unnatural purple in the early morning. My odometer ticked up, the miles kept adding, but the GPS showed me still at the same exact location, cycling around mile 63 like the truck was a toy on a broken slot track. Radio static filled the cab. Then the same traffic report blared, word for word, 6 times in a row. At each loop, I tasted more and more of the sea, salt stinging my lips and tongue as if the air itself thickened with brine. The smell grew driving, bordering on rot, like kelp washed too long on warm rock. My calls to dispatch didn't go through. Sophia's recorded voice kept answering slowed, grainy, warped, and sometimes interrupted by the low, foghorn-like moan that wasn't part of any system I knew. As I looped a 4th time, I saw another truck ahead, identical shape, and shade as mine. Heart sinking, I pulled alongside slower than necessary. The driver inside was me. Or, maybe more honest, an older version of me. Same leather hat, Same battered coffee mug, but her hair gone gray, her eyes baggy and sunken, a fatigue resting over her like years of sleepless nights curled into a single moment. Her stare met mine with a slow, weary shake of her head, like warning or resignation, before she eased ahead and vanished into a fog bank that hadn't been there seconds before. The fifth time around, the coast was deserted. I knew, in every nerve, that if I kept following the loop, it might never end. The lighthouse was in ruins, the beams shattered, and rusted-out trucks, abandoned, with moss gripping their flanks, lined the ditches. Every breath now tasted like seawater and copper. My skin prickled where the air had once been soft. Night had come in the span of what should have been early day. My logbook, when I checked it, was warped as if by water damage, the pages strangely sticky. Something kept scratching at my mind, like a radio tuned between stations. A repeated message, humming at the edge of hearing. Never words, more a pulse, wanting me to turn around and face something watching from the cliffs. Instead, I yanked the wheel and crashed into the guardrail, the impact so jarring I thought I'd broken my arm. The world flickered, static blinding my vision, every sense overloaded with the brine, the rot, the echo of my own desperate breathing. Then, silence. I woke at dawn at the exact start of the delivery route, my truck in perfect working order, 3 days missing, and my odometer showing 600 unaccounted miles racked up. There was no sign of damage, yet the guardrail at mile 63 bore a new smear of paint matching my truck's color. Sophia asked if I'd gotten lost in the fog, and the log showed all my calls marked private, unsent. I haven't found words for that lost time, nor can I explain the fragments. Glimpses of myself waiting at every turn, a feeling of other timelines converging at that gruesome strip of coast, and dozens of abandoned trucks in the mind's eye if not on any real map. Some part of me remains convinced that breaking the loop required more than luck, that an older self tried to warn me and I barely listened in time. If the road started repeating in endless circles, with strange voices breaking through the static, would you keep following the same path or try to break free? Thank you for joining me for these chilling journeys on Black Fears. Every story you hear is based on real testimonies, with names and details changed for privacy. If you've ever felt time slip or reality twist in the shadows of the road, share your story in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more true tales of terror from America's darkest highways. Only here on Black Fears.